Abraham Foxman, the current head, in my opinion, he was just stealing a page from an old book. He remembered the successful hysteria that was whipped up around Jesus Christ Superstar, and then seized on it when Mel Gibson's film was coming out, and played the same game. And he was very, he understood the mentality of the American media that pundits and columnists, they love to chase after, they like to prove their heroism by chasing after phantom enemies, like Mr. Gibson. I didn't see the film. I have no interest in seeing the film. I don't know anyone until this hysteria was whipped up that anyone who ever thought that Mr. Gibson had a clue of an idea in his head, that people ever even cared. It's like sometimes I used to hear these discussions about the deeper meaning of Michael Jackson's latest lyrics. Who cares? Who thinks about these things? I mean, they're on the order of intellectual curiosity, like Oprah's waistline. The only reason people whipped up this hysteria about Gibson's film was, as I said, to promote this hysteria about the new anti-Semitism. Just to speak factually on the question, I don't have time to go into it now. The record quite clearly shows, number one, there is no new anti-Semitism. I'll give you one example. A couple of weeks ago, the most respected survey organization in the United States, it's called the Pew PEW Research Center, put out a fat volume on attitudes towards the United States a year after the Iraq War. Some of you may have, how many people are familiar with the study? Anyone? Okay, a few of you saw the study. And mostly it was about how the whole world hates the United States. Well, that's not exactly, earth-shattering news after the invasion of Iraq. But what was interesting, the Pew Research Center added a few questions on anti-Semitism in Europe. They surveyed attitudes in the United States and 8 European countries. What did they conclude? Quite interesting. They concluded not only was there no evidence of a new anti-Semitism in Europe, but they compared the results of their findings to 14 years ago, to the survey they did in 1990. And they found in critical countries like Great Britain, Russia, and Germany, they found that attitudes towards Jews were actually more favorable now than they were 14 years ago. Not only is there no new anti-Semitism, but by any rational reckoning, it had actually diminished. Well, if that's true, how do you account for this hysteria? And basically, I've gone through all the reports except one. I have to admit it's a gap. The new one just came out last week, and it's 345 pages on the web. I don't have the heart, I shouldn't say this in public, I don't have the heart to print it out on my departmental printer because the secretary will probably throttle me if she finds out. The toner will be wiped out. And so I'm not sure yet how to get that report without incurring the wrath of my departmental secretary. But apart from that report, I've read everything that's been written on the topic, because I'm writing about that subject for a future publication. Well, what does the record show? A large amount of what's called the new anti-Semitism is sheer fraud, literally. They'll cite, for example, open up a book by this fellow named Mr. Schoenfeld. He's the editor of Commentary magazine, the main Jewish periodical in the United States. And Schoenfeld cites as a terrible example of anti-Semitism the case of the University of Chicago, where a professor refused to supervise a dissertation on Zionism or Jewish history. Okay, I happen to live in Chicago now. I'm in exile from New York. I was curious. I phoned up the University of Chicago. Whenever I make my inquiries, my first place to check, I check with the Campus Hillel, the Jewish Life Organization. I called up the University of Chicago's Campus Hillel. I asked them, is there any truth to this? They said they never heard of it. I then called up the University of Chicago administration. Have you heard about this? Oh, they said what happened was there was a professor of medieval history. She was asked to supervise a thesis on Zionism, a topic about which she knew nothing, and the person changed advisors. That was it. And that became an example of anti-Semitism at the University of Chicago. I started to go through many cases. There was a famous case in San Francisco State University, here, there. They all turned out to be fraudulent. They all turned out to be fake. I'll give you an interesting example, a kind of funny example, actually. There was a case. How many of you read the publication Cocoon? Anyone? Raise your hand. Okay, Cocoon is a progressive Jewish magazine, generally sympathetic on issues having to do with Palestinians. So there's a big article by a woman named Miriam Greenspan, headlined "The New Anti-Semitism." The first paragraph, she cites the case of a Yale student who was assaulted in his dorms by an Arab. Okay, I called up Yale University, called up the Campus Hillel, hear about it, never heard of it. Call up Yale University administration, hear about it, never heard of it. Well, I called up Miriam Greenspan, I emailed her, I said, well, what's the story here? Nobody's heard of it. I said, where's your evidence? She said, I heard it on Pat Robinson's 700 Club. Pat Robinson is this extreme right-wing Christian fanatic and Christian Zionist. That was her evidence. She heard it, watching Pat Robinson's 700 Club. Okay, a large part of it is simply fraud. Then there's also a large part of it where criticism of Israel is simply categorized as anti-Semitism. Literally. A few examples, there was a famous report that came out a few months ago called Manifestations, and they list all these examples of rising anti-Semitism. What examples do they give? Well, they say, at a convention of the new Italian Communist Party, some people were wearing a keffiyeh. That's new anti-Semitism. There was a book by a Palestinian that was on display. Some of you may recall that the wife of the head of the European Bank, Greta Thunberg, she displayed a flag of the Palestinians on her balcony during the siege of Jenin. That's classified in the report as anti-Semitism. So, straightforwardly, criticism of Israel is being classified as anti-Semitism, and then you would expect that anti-Semitism, if that's the definition, is going to rise during events like the siege of Jenin. And then there's the third category, and that is, it's true to say that there's been a hostile feeling towards Jews, which is a spillover from a hostile feeling towards Israel. Is that a surprise? Not really. During the war in Vietnam, given what the United States was doing in Vietnam, it provoked a large anti-Americanism. What the Nazis did during World War II provoked a large anti-Germanism. So is it really so surprising and shocking that if Israel, which proclaims itself a Jewish state, legally the sovereign state of the Jewish people, and Jewish organizations overwhelmingly publicly support what Israel does, is it really a shock that criticism of Israel, the state of the Jewish people, spills over into criticism and hostility towards Jews? To my thinking, it's lamentable. It's a sorry state of affairs. But is it shocking? Is it surprising? I don't remember any Americans being particularly shocked that what the U.S. was doing in Vietnam would evoke an anti-Americanism. That's, as far as I can tell, the full range of what's called the new anti-Semitism, deliberately orchestrated, as in the past, whenever Israel faces a public relations crisis. Now, that's the second aspect. The first is the mystification. The second is the invocation of the Holocaust and the new anti-Semitism. And the third source of all of this confusion and controversy and dissent, in my view, completely illegitimate over the Israel-Palestine conflict, goes back to the videotape that you saw a few moments ago. And it's a serious issue. It's a real problem. The problem is as follows. Large amounts of what's produced, quote-unquote, scholarly publications on the Israel-Palestine conflict, they are not what you would call within the framework of legitimate dissent, not within the framework of legitimate disagreement. A lot of what's produced on this particular topic is flat out, uncontroversially, sheer, unadulterated fraud. Now, that's not so shocking. Lots of people publish nonsense on many topics. The Flat Earth Society continues to promote or publish books proclaiming the Earth is flat. So, at one level, we ought not to be altogether shocked that on this topic as well, where people are emotionally, politically invested, there's going to be a large proliferation of fraud and fabrication as well. But here, the problem is different. And the problem is different for the following reason. In most of academic life, it doesn't work perfectly. It's replete, filled with flaws, but nonetheless there exists something that we can call, roughly speaking, quality control. We have sitting in the first row a Palestinian who was once a distinguished physicist, and now he's a lawyer in Canada. And as a scientist, he knows that there's all kinds of mechanisms in any kind of scholarly undertaking to root out, as well as one with human faculties can root out fraud. There's things called peer review, where your peers examine your findings. There are, in the case of the sciences, the rapid repetition of the experiments to see whether the results are the same as were proclaimed by the scientists who discovered a breakthrough. There's all sorts of mechanisms built in for quality control. Obviously, in the social studies, I don't call them sciences, they're not sciences, silly. In the social studies, we don't have the same precision of quality control. We don't have laboratories, but we have some mechanisms. Namely, if a book is published which claims to make quite unusual statements or claims, the first thing anyone asks the next, if you're in academia, the first question you always ask is, who published it? You want to know if it's a crackpot press or it's a serious press. A standard question, who published it? Then another question will be, who blurred the book? Who wrote blurbs in the back and praised the book? A third obvious question will always be, what were the reviews like? And in that basis, okay, it doesn't always work perfectly. And we know, for example, somebody as a first-rate mind as Professor Chomsky, he doesn't always get the best reviews. So that's not always the most accurate of controls. But nonetheless, it provides something, separating out the crackpot and vanity presses from the mainstream presses, separating out the crackpots from those who are operating pretty much within the spectrum. Here is the problem. When you come to the Israel-Palestine conflict, there is no longer any quality control. The crackpot publications, the sheer fraud and fabrication is not turned out by crackpot presses and vanity presses. It's turned out by the most mainstream and respected presses. It's published by, if not always written by, distinguished professors from distinguished universities, some of whom are even chairs at Harvard Law School. It gets excellent reviews in all mainstream publications. It gets excellent reviews in mainstream publications even after it's been revealed to be a fraud. The exchange I had with Professor Dershowitz and the subsequent correspondence and columns written on it in magazines like The Nation, they were widely known. There was no secret about what happened. It wasn't difficult at all to prove the case. In fact, subsequent to the debate, it fell into my hands a copy of what's called the proofs of a book. For those of you who don't know the technical jargon, it basically works like this. Before a book is published, and before it's in its final form for publication, a publisher distributes what's called the proofs. The proofs still contain some errors, hasn't been gone over yet by the editor, by all the editors and so forth. And what a publisher tries to do is they send out to various reviewers copies of the proofs. So when the actual publication date of the book is reached, the reviewer will have read the proof and therefore can write the review on the day of publication, because they tried to time the review with the publication date. It fell into my hands a copy of the proofs for Dershowitz's book. And in the proofs, it says in the footnotes, before the footnotes were actually entered, it says, copy from Joan Peters. It does. It says it. There was no question about the plagiarism. Those facts were publicized. Here's the question. Did anyone even ask Professor Finkelstein, can you forward me a copy of those proofs? I'd like to see them. Did anyone show any interest in the copy? It happens I had read the book as soon as it came out. Well, the reviews didn't come out for a few weeks. The Times reviewed the book about a couple of months later, the New York Times. The Boston Globe reviewed it. The Washington Post reviewed it. Your Globe and Mail reviewed it. Your Globe and Mail even mentioned the controversy. And then went on to give the book a rave review. It got rave reviews everywhere. It made no difference. The fact that, one, he plagiarized, which is the great no-no of academia. In academia, you can do anything. You can cite, or you can state the world is flat, so long as you have a footnote saying Flat Earth Society, July to August 1936. As long as you have a footnote. The one thing you can't do in academia is plagiarize. I don't know why there's such a hysteria over it. There was a famous folk singer, some of you may know, his name is Pete Seeger. And Pete Seeger's father was a famous musicologist named Charles Seeger. And he once was asked about the issue of plagiarism, and speaking as a musicologist, how music is transferred from one generation to the other. He once said, quote, "Plagiarism is basic to all culture." That is to say, you're always borrowing consciously and unconsciously from everybody else. So, but let's leave that aside. It still is the great no-no, the great taboo of academic life to plagiarize. You get expelled for plagiarism, flat out. He not only plagiarized, but he plagiarized from the Joan Peters hoax. Now that's pretty amazing. To plagiarize from a hoax. It's as if somebody were writing a book on the Nazi Holocaust and were not only to plagiarize from an earlier book, but were to plagiarize from a Holocaust denial book. Did it affect his reputation? No. Did it affect the reviews? No. Nothing. The whole book, from start to finish, including the author's name, is fake. Not only do I not believe he wrote the book, I have no doubt that until we met, he didn't read the book. I mean that seriously. If you remember, you have to listen carefully. But for those of you who are watching the video, if you recall when the issue of turn-speak came up, I said to him, you used the expression turn-speak, and Joan Peters used it. And he went, yeah. It came from someone else. It came from someone else. I said, yeah, it came from Orwell. She wrote Orwell. He said, yeah, Orwell. He didn't remember that Orwell was in the book because he didn't even read the book. Not that it makes a big difference, but he says he mentioned me once in the book. I don't care, but it was twice. You don't forget anyone who's written a book. The book came out in July. I was debating him in October. 3 months elapsed. You don't forget so much if you read the book. I wrote books 10 years ago. I can still tell you what's in the paragraph because he struggled to construct the paragraph. He didn't write the book. I don't think he even read the book. I was kind of surprised. I was expecting for him to go for the jugular because several times, I'm not sure if you saw it, several times I kept saying things like, and I was taunting him, I'll admit it. I said, the book you claim to have written. And I expected him to sort of like implode. You know, when you tell somebody a book that they wrote, you say, claim to have written. You know, there's no bigger insult. But he was actually quite calm about it. It was as if he had said, oh, that's interesting, how do you know? And that, to me, is the third, big source of confusion, the big source of dissent, totally illegitimate, that there's this vast proliferation of flat-out lies, disinformation, and nonsense on the topic. You read Dershowitz's book, he says things like, the Palestinian terror leadership is sending out suicide bombers with AIDS and hepatitis B in the hope that when they blow themselves up, they'll contaminate the Israeli victims with AIDS and hepatitis B. It's not only that it's perverse, that it's demented, that it's pathological, but the sources that he cites, if you go look at the sources, they never say it. He says that Palestinian female suicide bombers, and he names several in particular, a woman named Akras from Bethlehem, he names them. He says that they were raped by terrorist operatives, and that's why they committed the suicide bombings. Okay, perverted, pathological, demented. the conjuring of a freakish mind, but also, what's his source? It's an Israeli website where they say Palestinian sources told Israeli secret police and so on and so forth. You go back and you look at the literature, a lot's been written about several of the Palestinian female suicide bombers. It's just flat out fraud. Nobody has ever said that. There's no evidence to support it. Nothing. I mean, not even fabricated evidence. There's nothing. He has the case of, there was a famous case in 1995 of a Palestinian named Harazat who was shaken to death. That was one of the Israeli forms of torture, to shake you and finally he died. It was a famous case. It went to the Israeli High Court. The Israeli Justice Department admitted he died from shaking. There were several forensic doctors who examined the case. They all, on the Israeli side, there was a Scottish pounder, I think from Scotland. He examined the case. They all agreed he died from shaking. You go to the Israeli court, because it went up to the Israeli court, that particular issue. You go to the Israeli High Court decision, and they say in the High Court decision, all agree that Harazat died from shaking. It's right there, uncontroversial. What does Dershowitz write? He says, an independent inquiry found that Harazat died from personal causes having nothing to do with the shaking. Just makes it up flat. What's his citation? He cites the Israeli High Court decision. The decision that says all agree he died from shaking. Why does he do it, Dershowitz? Somebody asked me that question. It was a reasonable question. Somebody once asked, look, he's a Harvard professor, he's very wealthy, he has at his fingertips so many research assistants, 6 of them are named in the acknowledgments. Why didn't he just have fact-checkers go over the book? Well, that was an interesting question. Why these colossal, grotesque, egregious, absurd falsifications? But there is a reason. And the reason is important for us to understand. The first point to make is, even though Dershowitz devotes about 3/4 of the book to human rights issues, never, not once, in all of those pages, does he ever cite a mainstream human rights organization. Never cites Amnesty, never cites Human Rights Watch, never cites B'Tselem. He can't, because none of the mainstream human rights organizations support the nonsense that he is peddling. And that brings us to the last point, and the point which I think we should try to, I hope, we all walk home with this evening. The reason he couldn't consult fact-checkers, the reason he couldn't get the facts right was because were he to get the facts right, the book couldn't be called The Case for Israel. It would have to be called The Case for Palestine. Thank you.
Sort of. So Mr. Finkelstein is going to take your questions right now. I'm not going to be too terribly strict about the time limits on questions. I just have one request that everybody try to be respectful in their questions. I'm sure Dr. Finkelstein will be respectful in his answers. I don't want to discourage anybody from asking hard questions. I hope to hear a number of those. Just be respectful and everybody get their answers, their questions answered.
This isn't always a trick question. I'm kind of curious. We hear this a lot in Canada. Is there a Jewish lobby in the States, as we know?
Well, that was a very simple question. I wish I could give a simple yes or no answer. There is a Jewish lobby, and the lobby is powerful, and it manages to get its way on many issues. But my own view is, granting all of that, and not wanting to deny reality or facts as I understand them, there's a tendency to attach more importance to the lobby than I think it merits. The fact of the matter is, it's often used as an excuse for doing nothing to claim that there's this vast conspiracy and lobby which renders all of our efforts null and in the face of which we're impotent. No, I don't agree with that at all. They are powerful, they have huge resources, they can make life difficult, but that doesn't mean that we can't respond and that they're invulnerable. They have their weapons, the classic weapons of those in their shoes. They have the weapons of power, and they have the weapon of money. Yes, they have those resources. And they are formidable resources. Nobody should kid oneself. But we have formidable weapons too. We have the weapons of truth, and we have the weapon of justice. And those two weapons, in my opinion, they can, if they're wielded correctly, the weapons of truth and justice can trump the weapons of power and money. But we have to learn to wield them correctly. We have to do exactly what the person who introduced me at the beginning was saying. And at first I was feeling a little queasy about his remarks because I thought it was a preface to I'm passing around the bucket for money. But it wasn't. It was a preface to we worked hard, we sacrificed, we spent money, we lost time, we did everything, but look, we have a success. We too can win if we're willing to make the sacrifices that, to be honest, the same kind of sacrifices the Zionist movement made to achieve its goal. We have to learn, and there are some lessons to learn from them. I don't want to learn their ruthlessness, because they were ruthless and they were thugs. I don't want to learn that side. But there is something to be learned about commitment to a cause, conviction, working hard for a belief, and willing to accept the sacrifices that come with it. Something we should learn. Take the case of Abba Eban. Most of you recall as the formidable foreign minister of the state of Israel. Eban was a smart guy. No question about it. He graduated with triple honors from Oxford or Cambridge. I think Cambridge, don't hold me to it. Very smart guy. He could have done whatever he wanted with his life. Instead, he devoted himself to the Zionist cause. The Zionist cause was a backwater. It was, don't get the idea that it was, rich people and controlling the earth and the protocols of the elders of Zion. No. It was a bunch of little Jews in the sense of importance. Little Jews mostly from Eastern Europe. Mr. Eban, he was willing to forego the power and the prestige that he easily could have had in order to devote himself to the Zionist cause. Personally, I think it was the wrong choice. But there's something to be learned about somebody willing to give up the power, the prestige, and everything that comes with it for a cause. And if we're willing to make that kind of commitment, we can have many events as successful as the one this evening. We shouldn't attribute all of our failures to the Jewish lobby. We have to also look at ourselves and look around you, look at the potential. If, like the people who organized this event, the potential if you're willing to work hard and make the sacrifices.
Hi, I was hoping that you could comment on the wall that Israel is building and how you think that's going to affect the two-state solution. Also, can you get the $10,000 to Dershowitz?
Well, I'll take the second question first. This is the easier one. Obviously, you're not going to get $10,000 in Dershowitz. So I didn't really care about the $10,000. The folks who produced the show, they said, can you find a quick error so you'll have to hand over the check? And the error with the, 2 to 3,000 instead of 200 to 300,000, it was so easy to prove because you have right here Morris's book and you have Dershowitz's book. I didn't think that was the most significant error in the book. I just thought it would be easy to win the money, and I didn't really care about the money, though it would have been nice if it went to Geneva. On the question of the wall, first of all, the wall is not a complicated question to any normal person, even a 6-year-old. If Israel wants to build a wall, of course, like any other sovereign state in the world, it has the right to build a wall. But it only has the right to build a wall on its property. The Great Wall of China does not go around Nepal. The Great Wall of China is along the border of China. If Israel wants to build a wall, build it. The problem with the wall is, A, it has nothing to do with protecting Israel, because if it were about protecting Israel, they would build the wall along the Israeli border. What the wall is about is protecting the settlements. That's why it's being built around the settlements. Now, I don't think it requires the World Court, though I'm glad they took the case. I don't think it requires the International Court of Justice to understand you don't have the right to build a wall in other people's property. Anyone knows that. Hey, my late mother and father did not get along with the neighbors. And there was a lot of controversy between us and our neighbors. And finally, my parents built a fence around their property. But let me tell you, before they built the fence, they had to bring in, and this is no exaggeration for anyone who's a homeowner, they had to bring in a surveyor to check down to the quarter inch. I'm serious. That fence was on their property and not the neighbor's property. Because if it were on the neighbor's property, that fence gets torn down. Well, the same principle applies here. It's not complicated. It's not rocket science. It's not about defending Israel. It's about incorporating large parts of the West Bank into Israel. The estimates now are about 50% of the West Bank will be incorporated into Israel through the wall. And the Palestinians will get a Bantustan like the one that the South Africans gave, the South African white regime gave to the indigenous population in the era of apartheid.
I'd like to know where you weigh in on the notion of Jewishness being a race, and also combine Zionism by a concise definition of Zionism.
Well, on the question of, what's the Jew? Jews ponder that question all the time, and enough books are probably written on the topic to fill this room, believe it or not. Jews like to write, and they like to write about themselves, and they like to ponder these questions. I don't think it's such an important question, who is a Jew? It's only an important question if you live in a state that's not a democratic secular state. Then who is a Jew is obviously a very important question, because rights are inequitably distributed according to whether or not you're Jewish. So to my thinking, the real question is, why is it an important question in Israel? And it is an important question because Israel is not a democratic state. If it were a democratic state, it wouldn't be a question. We don't ponder in the United States. We don't have battles in our legislative body about who is and who isn't a Christian. But in Israeli Knesset, there are big arguments and debates over that. The fact that they debated tells you that it's not a democratic state. They debated because in that society, whether or not you're Jewish is an important question. Let's take the comparable case of the American South. Whether or not you were black during the era of slavery was a very important question. Now, most of you are thinking, that's not so complicated. Oh, yes, it is. They had a very nuanced differentiation between what they called octoroons, those who were 1/8 Jewish, quadroons, those who were 1/4 Jewish. It was a very complicated question because it was a very significant issue. If you were white, or you passed as white, you weren't an octoroon or a quadroon, you weren't a slave. Same thing in Germany during the Nuremberg, the years of the Nazi regime. It was a very complicated question, who's a Jew? You know, Professor Hilberg devotes maybe 100 pages to trying to going through how a Jew was defined. Was it both your grandparents on the father's side, both the grandparents on the mother's side? What about if one grandparent was Jewish and one Christian on the father's side, but two were Jewish on the Jewish side? And believe me, that was a very important question. It may have decided whether you ended up in the gas chamber. That was a very important question, but it was an important question because it wasn't a democratic society. So I think the important question we should be asking ourselves is, why are issues like that even debated, except privately? You know, as a private issue, you can debate whatever you want. But as a public political issue, it's only debated because it's not a democratic society. On the question of Zionism, my personal view, as I said last night when I was talking to some people after I came, I landed, I don't think on this particular question we should get caught up in ideological questions like, are you or are you not a Zionist? I don't think these ideological litmus tests are important. The litmus test is, where do you stand on resolving this conflict? Do you support the international consensus for a full Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza, the creation of 2 states, mutual recognition? If you support it, that's all in my book that's important. You can't demand ideological agreement. People with vastly different ideologies can agree on basic political questions. Ralph Nader is clearly a person of the left. Pat Buchanan is clearly a person of the right. They happen to agree on NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Ideologically, very different. I think these ideological questions become very divisive. Don't write anyone off because they're a Zionist. You're entitled to your ideological, your ideological allegiances. I happen to be, and I'm not afraid to say it, I'm a communist in a small c. I believe in sharing, killing. I believe in community. Okay? But I have many friends, most of my friends, who think a lot of my ideas are crackpot. Okay, but we can agree on the political questions, on the moral questions. I happen not to be a believer. I'm an atheist. Okay, I meet many people who are devout believers. We can agree on the moral questions. You came at it through God. I came at it through, who the hell knows? I came at it through Kant. No, I didn't. I don't understand Kant. But okay, I came at it my own way. We could disagree. So let's avoid, the ideological litmus test. Are you or are you not? Or are you or have you ever been a Zionist? And let's stick to the practical questions. We want to resolve this conflict. Let's find as much agreement as we can for resolving it.
One of the reasons I came to this lecture was to hear you on the question of using the Holocaust as a prop for the Israelis to commit the occupation. And then the historical question that you have probably don't have time to dwell, that the Jews in the Arab lands and in Palestine, before the occupation of Palestine to create the state of Israel, were never exterminated. In fact, they were protected. And as opposed to the European collaborator governments that turned in the Jews to the Germans to be slaughtered, there is no evidence that the Arabs during the same period did the same thing.
Okay, look, I think you can make some broad generalizations. One broad generalization you can make is, whatever you want to say about the condition of Jews in the Arab world, everybody agrees, there's no disagreement. The Jews never suffered in the Arab world the kinds of discriminations and persecutions that they suffered in Europe. That's not an issue. As to whether the condition was of the kind that you described, namely everybody, as it were, got along, I don't know the topic well enough, and I always prefer, where I don't know the topic well enough, not to speak on it, but I would say that's not the consensus, that Jews suffered all sorts of discriminations in the Arab world. Can't be particularly surprised at it. Does it mean there's no possibility for people to get along? No, I don't believe that at all. You find places in this world where the hatreds were much more vicious than they were between Jews and Arabs in the Arab world. I don't think the hatreds were great there, at least as far as I can tell. But much worse, and people learned to get along. But I think we should make every effort. We should always strive, exactly as I said earlier. We have to make every effort to strive for the truth. My view is, I've never found an instance where truth is my enemy. I feel very confident that there's a famous line by the English philosopher John Stuart Mill in his little book, which I love to teach every time I do teach, every quarter, every semester. There's a little book called On Liberty. And he says at some point in On Liberty, in the opinion not of bad men, but the best of men, nothing which is contrary to truth is useful. The truth is always useful, and I'm never afraid of it. I try not to be, even though sometimes it's hard. We all know the expression, truth is a bitter pill to swallow, and sometimes it's painful. But even if it's painful, it's always useful. And lies are simply not useful. And I think, in all of these questions that we raise, we should struggle hard towards truth and avoid any kinds of mystification and fairy tales. I'm not saying this one is, but I think we should be careful on those particular topics. I do have to say one last thing. I've always found that when you meet Palestinian Arabs from the 448 who had normal daily relations with Jews in Palestine, for example, I met Fuad last night, they're always much more civil, humane, and never They're never gripped by any kind of hysteria or hatred. And I met many, because when you're in occupied territories, you meet many Palestinians who knew Jews during the Mandate years, the older generation. And they're always very humane, civilized, never gripped by any kinds of hatred. And I think basically it's because they had memories, some sort of memories, of having known Jews, and that the Jews weren't such, diabolical, evil people that, sometimes you may think they are. And that gives me hope. That gives me hope that people, they get to know each other, learn about each other. There's possibilities for living together.
You clearly dismiss any notion of anti-Semitism against the Jews, any notion of new anti-Semitism against the Jews.
Correct.
And
New anti-Semitism, not anti-Semitism. Of course there's anti-Semitism.
as merely whipped up hysteria, fraudulent nonsense, no lie. Can you please help define for me the following acts? Number one, Jewish families were attacked vacationing in Kenya. Number two, El Al counter in LA was shot at. Number three, synagogue bombing in Turkey. Synagogue bombings all over Europe, including France. Chanting death to Jews in downtown Calgary, in the Heritage Building, 2 years ago. Synagogue attack in Edmonton 2 years ago. Can you please just help me distinguish between crackpot and mainstream definitions?
I'd be happy to address those questions because that's something I've been looking into and reading the literature on the topic, the available evidence. What does the evidence show? Number one, I mentioned to you the report that came out, the new report, the 345-page report that just came out from the European Center for Racism and Xenophobia. Well, the first conclusion is most of the attacks that have occurred, the attacks were committed by right-wing skinheads. They said to a lesser extent, though it's not certain, because the evidence isn't absolutely certain, to a lesser extent it's been committed by disaffected Muslim youths in Europe. Yes, there has been violence, there have been attacks, but is there now, as is claimed, a pervasive new anti-Semitism in the heart of the European population? Is it pervasive in the heart of the Canadian population, in the mainstream? Is it pervasive in the heart of the American population? No. Exactly as has always been the case, right-wing extremist skinheads have committed racist, anti-Semitic acts. That's not what they're claiming in the new anti-Semitism. They're saying it's widespread across the board in Europe and North America. There's no evidence for that. Let's take the case even of the synagogue bombings. I was curious. I opened up the fellow Schoenfeld's book. He has a new book, The Fellow from Commentary. He says, the book is called The Return of Anti-Semitism. He looks at the period from the New Intifada, beginning September 2000. He looks at the period for several weeks after. And he says in the book, there were 6 synagogue bombings in Britain and France, in which synagogues were razed, R-A-Z-E-D, to the ground, destroyed. And there were 28 other acts of arson against synagogues. Well, that is a significant number. I was curious. The only source he cites is the Stephen Roth Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism in Tel Aviv. And the Stephen Roth Center happens to post all of its findings on the web. I went through the year 2000. The Roth's findings are broken down for Britain and France. I clicked on Britain, there was nothing. I clicked on England, excuse me, I clicked on France, and for that period, it's true. One synagogue was partially destroyed. It was a 2-floor synagogue with a congregation of 40 in a suburb of Paris called Trappes. Okay, that's wrong. That's terrible. But in the book, 1 became 6. 8 acts of arson became 28 acts of arson. Of course, 1 is 1 too many, 8 is 8 too many. But is it as is being proclaimed? As Mr. Foxman of the Anti-Defamation League claims, that Jews are now facing the most serious threat since the late 1930s in Germany? Are we on the eve of the final solution here? This is sheer hysteria. Orchestrated, fabricated hysteria. Let's add one crucial point. Look at the Pew Research Center finding. It didn't find an escalating anti-Semitism against Jews. In fact, it found a diminution, as I mentioned. But there was another finding, which is not altogether trivial. It did find an escalating anti-Muslim hostility in Europe. Rational people, were they not given to political agendas, would be worrying not about a non-existent new anti-Semitism, but they would be worrying about a new anti-Muslim hysteria. That's a real issue for a rational world.
Professor Finkelstein, you had mentioned that major publications such as the Toronto Globe and Mail in Canada and others in the United States had given rave reviews of Professor Dershowitz's book, The Case for Israel. Can you comment on the importance of the Internet as a way to do an end run, as it were, around such rave reviews and major publications which sell the message that the Dershowitz view of the Palestine-Israeli question is perfectly legitimate and in no sense a fraud?
Well, look, there's no question that the Internet has been a breath of fresh air, and it's been an important source for disseminating truth. As a matter of fact, that's one reason why, if you read all of the publications about the new anti-Semitism, they're all hysterical about the Internet. We have to control the Internet. Too much, quote-unquote, anti-Semitism is being distributed and disseminated through the Internet. We have to stop the Holocaust denial that's being proliferated on the Internet. Number one, as simply a matter of principle, I don't believe anything should be subject to censorship, because nobody has a monopoly on truth. Nobody is God, nobody is infallible, nobody has a monopoly on truth. And it's incumbent on each of us to find out for ourselves and discover for ourselves what's true and what's not. So as a matter of principle, I'm against any kind of censorship. But there's a second issue here. Namely, when they talk about wanting to curb Holocaust denial, when they want to curb the new anti-Semitism, what are they really referring to? I don't think they care about the right-wing skinheads, you know, those kind of lunatics from Nebraska or Calgary. They don't care about that because everybody knows they're marginal crackpots. What they're concerned about, well, let's take the case of the ADL. I was supposed to speak at Georgetown University. Immediately the ADL wrote a letter to the president of Georgetown and said Finkelstein should not be allowed to speak. Why? He's a Holocaust denier. Then in France, they just instituted a lawsuit against my French publisher because my book, The Holocaust Industry, is anti-Semitic and Holocaust denial. Believe me, I couldn't care less. Well, it's silly. You know, I used to say, if you want to fault me for something, it would be Holocaust affirmation, because I don't stop talking about it. I grew up in that home. Okay, but Holocaust denial is kind of, it's not even. But the point is, when you hear them talk about, we need new legislation to curb anti-Semitism, to curb Holocaust denial. What they're really talking about is they want to prevent people like myself, of which there are many, no few of them Jewish. They want to prevent people from like myself, from being heard. That's the problem. Leaving aside the philosophical question, that in my view, nothing should be subject to censorship. There's a political question here. The political question is, they're using, once again, they're wielding the club of the Holocaust and the weapon of anti-Semitism, and are now wielding it and using it because they don't yet control the internet. The Izzy Aspers, the Morton Zuckermans, and all the rest, they control many of the newspapers. They don't yet control the internet, and that makes them very uncomfortable. Just like the old Communist Party in the Soviet Union was very uncomfortable if there wasn't 100% agreement. Even 1% of dissent used to drive them to distraction.
From your involvement politically that you mentioned recently in the issue, and within the context of legitimate dissent, how do you view the idea of self-determination by displaced Palestinians and other Palestinians who are principled in saying that the right to return and the question of East Jerusalem should be on the table before any peace process should be taking place? The idea here is to contrast the merit of this point of view versus the dominant international community point of view, the two-state solution. And how much do you think that this may be an impediment to moving the peace process forward?
It's a problem. I don't think the issue of the Palestinians is an easy one to resolve. I think we should be honest about that. I happen not to believe it's an insurmountable obstacle. My closest Palestinian friend is from Fular camp outside Hebron. His family is a refugee family, and we've been very close friends now for 16 years. And he'll tell me frankly that he's a conservative on the refugee question. He says we will not accept that we rotted in these camps for 50 years for nothing. He's a conservative on the right of return question. Nonetheless, I understand that Palestinians are perfectly reasonable, they're perfectly rational. If you present a proposal that's reasonable and rational, you can get agreement. The problem so far has been that Israel has played with smoke and mirrors to disguise completely unreasonable and unacceptable proposals as great concessions. No, they were not reasonable. My friend Muin Rabani, a very bright, very smart Palestinian, he works now for the international group in Jordan, and talked about the right of the return question, and he said to me, look, we will accept that if you give us a full stake in the West Bank and Gaza, then maybe we'll have to give up a return. But don't think that you're going to leave 300,000 settlers in place in the West Bank. You're going to have Ma'ale Adnim cutting across from Jerusalem to Jericho. You're going to cut the West Bank in half. Then cut it again in the northern with the settlement of Ariel. You're going to give us a state that looks like a leopard's skin and hold out a state and then say we've made a grand concession and you have to give up the right of return. And that is reasonable. Present the Palestinians with a reasonable offer, and hopefully, if they haven't been driven to madness, and we're getting close to that, if they haven't been driven to madness by the occupation, and managed through the horrors of the past 35 years, managed to preserve their sanity. And it ain't easy. But so far they've managed. We're getting close to the point of no return. It's rapidly, and I don't like to be a Cassandra, with the horror stories about what's coming. That's too much drama and melodrama, and we don't need drama and melodrama. But it is true to say the conflict is rapidly degenerating into a war. Simply tit for tat. You killed 5 of ours, we want to kill 5 of yours. And once it reaches that point, it's hopeless. And we're moving in that direction. I remember I was talking to people last night. I spoke at some with Mr. Dr. Rantisi, the new head of Hamas, the fellow who replaced Sheikh Yassin, was assassinated, and we talked about the issue of the attacks, and he said to me, look, when the second Intifada began, the ratio was 10 to 1. 10 Palestinians were killed for 1 Israeli killed. We've now reduced it, he said, with a certain amount of, I won't call it pride, let's just call it satisfaction. He says we've reduced it to 3 to 1, the ratio. Now it's 3 Israelis killed for each Palestinian. I can understand that. I am not going to pretend to be holier than thou. My feet are squarely planted in the real world. I can understand those sentiments because I heard them from my parents when they used to talk about World War II. And they were very happy when they heard German civilians were being killed. They said, if we go, we want to take them with us. Not the most ennobling sentiment. I can't say I was proud to hear that, but I certainly understood my parents, and I had full grasp of their humanity. And I think as human beings, they were very impressive. I can understand it, but understanding it is very different than saying it's politically sensible. When it comes down to just wanting to reduce the ratio, it's a dead end. I'm not attacking Dr. Rantisi right now, although I completely oppose the suicide bombings. I can understand them, I oppose them. But we have to be honest. Can anyone imagine someone like Nelson Mandela saying, we reduced the ratio from 10 to 1 to 3 to 1. It's not a political statement. It's a statement that marks the degeneration of politics into an ugly tribal war. And once it reaches that point, there's no possibility of even a reasonable offer being accepted. So I think we have our work cut out for us, that before we've crossed that threshold of no return, and it's just a tribal war, we have to try to reach a reasonable resolution, which I still believe the Palestinians will accept. If it's reasonable, if it gives them, if it accords them the same minimum of human dignity as any other people on this earth wants for themselves and is entitled to.
Dr. Finkelstein, this may be a bit off topic, but do you have concerns, as I feel we have concerns, for the dog being wagged by the tail, that Israel is telling the United States how high to jump and when, and more specifically, I'm seeing a hand that calls itself neo-conservatives and the likes of Wolfowitz and Pearl. Do you have concerns that may relate not just to regime change in the East, but specifically in this situation?
You know, everybody asks the question. In my opinion, it's a perfectly legitimate question to ask. There's no necessary anti-Semitic implication asking the simple question. Whether the Jewish lobby or the Zionist lobby or the Israel lobby, whatever you want to call it, whether it has achieved such power, it determines U.S. policy. That's a factual question. It's an empirical question. It's not a question that either does or doesn't define you as being an anti-Semite. It's legitimate. Whether or not it's true is a separate question. I happen to believe it's no longer an important question. And the reason I don't believe it's no longer an important question is because Israel is so now inextricably intertwined with U.S. interests and aims in the Middle East that to separate them out as two entities, here is Israel, or the tail, here is the United States, the dog, and the tail wagging the dog is the American Jewish organizations. It doesn't make any sense anymore because they're not one here and one there. So, for example, does anyone ask the question when Governor Bush became President Bush? Does anyone ask the question whether President Bush is acting out of the interests of Texans or Americans? No, nobody would ask the question like that for the simple reason that it's a very artificial distinction between Texas here and America here. They're inextricably intertwined. I think it's pretty much the case now with Israel and the United States. To talk about, I think probably, Israel figures more centrally in American planning and thinking about the Middle East than surely Kansas or Nebraska or Iowa. It's very central and deeply integrated into American political strategic thinking. Disagreements arise. Well, some disagreements arise between Texas and the U.S. national government. They arise. But I think the distinction now is artificial. I don't think it's meaningful anymore. My opinion.
It's almost 9 o'clock and the university bookstore is waiting there since 5 for us too. Dr. Finkelstein has signed some books. just going to limit it to 2 more questions from each side. And I'm sorry for everybody, break everybody's heart who's standing, but you're welcome to come talk to Mr. Finkelstein after. So we're going to have to move on. It's almost 9 o'clock. So 2 more. Sorry.
I have a question that has sort of changed over the process of hearing other questions and your answers to those questions. So what I'd now like to ask is, do you think there's maybe a terminological problem that we have here that our freedom of speech is very important to us, obviously, and it's important for us to be protected from expressions of class or gender or sexual hatred. So I think that protecting us from hate speech is a very, very important thing that our freedom of speech protects us from. But meanwhile, you know, our freedoms are being in some ways hampered by this distinction that we have going on here. I don't know if you know, but I think last September, Canada had elected to send a specific delegate to a conference on the Middle East process, and that delegate was actually revoked from the process, and another one was chosen because that delegate was said to be too anti-Semitic. So that's actually affecting our democratic process, and it's severely affecting our freedom of speech. I understand from your biography that it's affecting your freedom of speech as well. When you are not actually making, as far as I can tell, comments that are anti-Semitic in their very nature in terms of Jewish people as individuals. You are making statements which concern the Jewish people as a nation, and I don't actually believe that it's a problem to be criticizing another nation. A lot of us in this room criticize America, we criticize Britain, we criticize China, Japan, whatever, it doesn't really matter. So do you think that maybe there's an important terminological distinction that needs to be made here?
Look, I think it's a fair question. I'm not sure if it's a terminological question. It's a kind of political question. Namely, it's the good and the bad side of political correctness. The good side of political correctness is it creates an atmosphere of tolerance on, say, a college campus, and it makes sure that everybody feels comfortable and at ease and can achieve his or her maximum without being subject to taunts, subject to all sorts of degrading language and sometimes degrading behaviors. And that's all well and good. And there's a downside to the political correctness, namely that people define terms like anti-Semitism, racism, and all sorts of other things in ways which chill any kind of real discussion and debate in a classroom. I happen to think it's a disaster, and I think that the pendulum has swung too far to the other side, the political correctness side. And at least the university where I teach, I can't speak in general, I think it makes for an impossibility for having any kind of real open debate and discussion. And the basic problem with political correctness is if everybody says what's politically correct, but they're not saying what they actually believe, there's no chance to ever change their mind, because they're not saying what they believe. And if you believe that maybe through argument and reason you can change people's minds, then you want to encourage people not to be politically correct, but to be politically incorrect. Say what you believe. And then at least it's out there, and we can debate, discuss, and maybe there's a chance I'll convince you. But if nobody's saying what they believe, there's no chance of changing another person's mind. And I think that has created real problems in the college classroom, and real problems for the reasons that you, I think, accurately articulated. The problem being, who defines what's racist? Who defines what's anti-Semitic? Who defines what's sexist? Well, that's a real problem.
are one of a kind. Aren't you afraid for your life? This is the first question. The
I
second,
can't hear you. You don't mind.
you are one of a kind. Aren't you afraid for your life? The second question is, how can the truth reach the people in North America if the media is owned by a certain group of people who manipulate the news in a certain way? Most of American people, we all know, they watch CNN or Fox News, and unfortunately, they never tell the truth. People ask me how we can get the truth. How, this is really a big problem. I mean, I'm so happy that you came tonight. Thank you very much. At least if you.
I don't want to pretend false modesty. On the other hand, I like to be factually accurate. I am not one of a kind. I am not even nearly one of a kind. You would be very surprised to learn how many people, just like myself, are working quite hard in much less privileged circumstances than myself, Jewish people, for a just resolution of the conflict. I'll just give one example. There's a fellow here sitting in the first row who was in the International Solidarity Movement, went over to the occupied territories. And those are brave souls, much more courageous than I am. They go out, they encircle Palestinians who are trying to dig a well, they encircle Palestinians who are trying to reap their crop. They're really brave. They're really courageous. A couple of them, 3 of them now, have been, well, 2 have been killed, and 1 has been severely injured. Rachel Corey was killed, Tom Kerndow was killed, and there was a 3rd fellow who was severely injured. It's an interesting fact that the estimates are about 30%, if not more, 30% of the volunteers in the International Solidarity Movement are Jewish. I say that's a pretty damn good showing. When you consider that Jews are probably 0.0000001% of the world's population, the fact that 30% of those international volunteers are Jewish, that's a pretty good showing. And we shouldn't forget those facts. Though it's also true to say that with the recent polarizations since the Second Intifada, we're losing a lot of people on the other side. That's also accurate. As to how to get the word out, my answer is very simple. Learn from the young people who organized today's event. That's a good way to get the word out.
I'll try to be as concise here as I can. I'm basically wondering if it seems to me the Zionist state in Israel is kind of hanging by a thread, and due to factors like growing secularization and cosmopolitan outlook of the Israeli people, that if they don't keep the population in a constant state of fear through like acts of so-called terrorism, that rationality might actually kick in. And the people might basically call for something like an actual democratic state, which would be neither Palestine nor Israel, but more like the democratic state of like the Fertile Crescent. I was wondering if you would agree with that if like, if Israelis left to their own devices, would actually like, achieve a rational state and like decide to like throw the Zionists out.
Look, number one, any observer from Mars, whether if that being were to alight on planet Earth, would say the whole world is irrational. Why do you have states in the first place? Does that make sense? Do borders make sense? Obviously, if you wanted to conjure up a world which was rational, then the world would be very different than it is today. So when you ask about whether Israelis will achieve rationality, we also have to ask whether the world will achieve rationality. We're all living in a crazy world in many ways. Do I have to go through the statistics? how food is wasted on the one side and 30 million children die each year from hunger on the other side, that's not very rational. That's even more irrational than the borders between Israel and Jordan. So before we talk about their irrationality, we have to look at the rationality of all of us and how the world, needs a lot of repairing. That having been said, there's no doubt that there's a calculated hysteria created in order, to create among Israelis and American Jews and Canadian Jews a siege mentality in order for them to support what Israel is doing. Namely, they, meaning all the non-Jews, are out to kill us, and we need a place to go when the next Holocaust begins. Yeah, there's no question that that's being artificially cultivated by Israel and its supporters in order to justify what Israel is doing. The only other point I would make is a lot of people, through a sense of hopelessness, despondency, despair, look at the forces on the other side and say Israel is hanging by a thread. It's a ripe fruit ready to drop. It can't go on much longer than it has, and hoping that the big breakthrough will come not from our side, but from their side, that they will finally collapse, as it were, under all the pressures exerted on them. That will never happen. There's a famous line by the American abolitionist Frederick Douglass. He said, "Power never concedes anything without a demand. It never has, it never will." If we're going to succeed, if we're going to achieve a just resolution of the conflict, it will only come about, not through the inertia on the other side, it will only come about if we make the effort, we organize, we make the sacrifice, and we work to make it happen. That's the only way it will happen.
Thank you, Dr. Finkelstein. I'll try and make this as brief as I possibly can, since mine is the last question. I suppose that any government which adopts the policy or a policy to fire missiles into crowded streets with the hopes of assassinating one man or two men or anything of that kind is truly indicative of a state of moral bankruptcy at the very least. Recently, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin was a recent victim of such an attack. My question is, what are your thoughts of that particular policy of flying around in helicopters and shooting missiles, wherever there are civilians in the hopes of killing one person? From really any perspective that you see fit to answer this, whether it's a legal question or other.
The way I'm going to answer it is as follows. Israel's policy of political liquidations, or what they call with their famous euphemisms, which then the whole press and media take over, the targeted assassinations, they are, as Human Rights Watch calls them, political liquidations. They're illegal under international law, they're unacceptable, they're immoral. And as I said earlier, the human rights organizations are very consistent on that particular question. Look at Amnesty International, look at Human Rights Watch. They're very consistent. The targeted assassinations are illegal under international law. The problem is the following. I was looking last week after the Sheikh Yassin liquidation. I was looking at the press, an article was the British press, because the Israeli High Court is supposed to rule pretty soon on the political liquidations. Israel's foremost scholar on international law, his name is Yoram Dinstein. Dinstein has not been bad in the past. He's a liberal. He's come out foursquare against the House demolitions, said they're illegal in international law, come out foursquare to the Fourth Geneva Convention, applies to Israel in the occupied territories. He's been good. And I was kind of disappointed when I read this thing said the targeted assassinations are absolutely legitimate and legal. And that tells me we've lost or losing because of the tactics on part of the Palestinian side. We're losing the whole Israeli population. Now, the view of groups like Hamas is there was nothing to lose because there was nothing ever there in the first place. The Israelis, it was all talk, it was all show.